The security badge beeped softly as Marcus Washington swiped it against the reader at 11:47 p.m. The Metropolitan Financial Corporation building stood like a monument to success in downtown Chicago, its 42 floors of glass and steel reaching toward the heavens. Inside those walls, fortunes were made and lost with the click of a mouse. But Marcus knew that the real power lay in what people revealed when they thought nobody important was watching. He pushed his cleaning cart through the marble lobby, the wheels squeaking slightly on the polished floor. The sound echoed in the vast space, a lonely rhythm that had become the soundtrack to his nights for the past 18 months. The security guard, Thompson, barely looked up from his magazine as Marcus passed. In Thompson's world, the night janitor was just part of the furniture, as unremarkable as the potted plants or the abstract art that decorated the walls. Marcus had learned to appreciate this invisibility. It was different from the visibility he had once commanded, back when his name was on the door of a corner office 3 cities away, when his recommendations could move markets and his signature could authorize million-dollar transactions. That was before the market crash of 2019, before his firm dissolved overnight, before he discovered that networking connections and impressive resumes meant little when economic storms swept through entire industries. The elevator carried him to the 38th floor, where the real power players of Metropolitan Financial had their offices. This was where the magic happened, where deals were struck and careers were made or destroyed. It was also where Marcus had encountered the most concentrated dose of casual racism he had ever experienced in his professional life. As he began his routine in the accounting department, Marcus could still hear the voices from earlier that evening. He had been cleaning the break room when 3 employees had walked in, not noticing him behind the coffee machine. "Did you see the new intern they hired?" Sarah Mitchell from Human Resources had said, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for office gossip. "Another diversity hire, if you ask me." "At least this one can probably read," Brad Peterson from marketing had replied, causing the group to laugh. "Remember when they tried to put that kid from the inner city in the analyst program? Lasted about 2 weeks before he washed out." "Well, what do you expect?" The third voice, belonging to Jennifer Walsh from Legal, had chimed in. "These people just don't have the same work ethic. They want everything handed to them." Marcus had continued cleaning, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but every word had been recorded by the small device hidden in his uniform pocket. It was the same device that had captured dozens of similar conversations over the past months, building a comprehensive record of the toxic culture that permeated this supposedly progressive corporation. The irony was not lost on him. Marcus Washington held an MBA from Harvard Business School, had spent 8 years climbing the corporate ladder at one of the most prestigious investment firms in the country, and had managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The work ethic that Jennifer Walsh questioned had driven him to graduate summa cum laude, to work 18-hour days as a junior analyst, and to build a reputation for brilliant market analysis that had made him one of the youngest vice presidents in his former firm's history. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he had been unable to find work in his field for over 2 years, despite his qualifications. What mattered was that every interview seemed to go well until he walked into the room, and then suddenly the position would be filled or on hold indefinitely. What mattered was that he had burned through his savings, lost his downtown condo, and had been forced to take whatever work he could find to pay rent on a studio apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots sometimes interrupted his sleep. The janitor position at Metropolitan Financial had been a last resort, a way to keep food on the table while he continued his job search. But it had quickly become something more valuable, a window into the machinery of corporate discrimination that he had never fully understood from his privileged position on the other side. Moving through the cubicles of the accounting department, Marcus methodically emptied trash cans and wiped down surfaces. In the recycling bin next to Todd Harrison's desk, he found a crumpled resume. The applicant was clearly qualified, with a degree from Northwestern and impressive experience at several top firms. The handwritten note clipped to it, however, told a different story. "Too ethnic," it read in Harrison's scrawling handwriting. "Won't fit with client base." Marcus photographed the note with his phone, adding it to the growing digital archive that he maintained on a secure cloud server. Every piece of evidence was meticulously catalogued, dated and cross-referenced. His legal training earned during night school while working his way up the corporate ladder had taught him the importance of documentation. Every racist joke, every discriminatory hiring decision, every moment of casual bigotry was being preserved for a reckoning that was coming sooner than anyone at Metropolitan Financial could imagine. The break room on the 38th floor was his next stop, and as he began cleaning the coffee maker, he noticed a group of senior executives had left behind the remnants of what appeared to be a late dinner meeting. Empty takeout containers and wine bottles suggested they had been celebrating something significant. The whiteboard near the conference table provided a clue. Q4 bonuses was written at the top, with a list of names and dollar amounts below. The numbers were staggering. Senior Vice President Michael Rodriguez was set to receive a bonus of $2.3 million. Director of Operations Karen Chen was getting $1.8 million. Even junior executives were looking at bonuses that exceeded Marcus's former annual salary. But what struck him most was not the amounts, but the handwritten comments next to some of the names. Next to the name of David Kim, a rising star in the derivatives department, someone had written, "Good for Asian guy." Beside the entry for Maria Santos, a talented analyst who had been with the company for 3 years, the comment read, "Surprising performance for her background." Marcus photographed the whiteboard, his hands steady despite the anger building in his chest. These people were making millions while casually denigrating the 39th floor of Metropolitan Financial Corporation hummed with a different energy than the levels below. Here, the carpets were thicker, the artwork more expensive, and the silence more profound. This was where the real decisions were made, where the future of thousands of employees was determined by men and women who had never walked in their shoes. Marcus pushed his cart down the hallway, past offices that commanded views of the entire city. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago sprawled out in all directions, its lights twinkling like stars in the darkness. From this height, the problems of ordinary people seemed very small indeed, which perhaps explained why the executives who worked here had such little understanding of the impact their decisions had on real lives. The first office belonged to Richard Sterling, the chief financial officer. Sterling was a man in his early 60s who had built his career during an era when diversity meant having one woman in the accounting department. His office was a shrine to his achievements, diplomas from prestigious universities, photographs with politicians and celebrities, awards from industry organizations that celebrated his financial acumen. As Marcus emptied Sterling's wastebasket, he discovered something that made his pulse quicken. Crumpled among the usual detritus of executive life was a draft of an internal memo, marked confidential, in red letters across the top. The subject line read, "Addressing Diversity Concerns, Strategic Communication Plan." Marcus smoothed out the paper and read with growing amazement. The memo outlined a comprehensive strategy for addressing recent complaints about the company's hiring practices, not by actually changing those practices, but by creating the appearance of change through carefully crafted public relations campaigns. The key, Sterling had written, is to demonstrate commitment to diversity without fundamentally altering our recruitment and promotion standards. We must be seen as progressive while maintaining the quality of our workforce that has made Metropolitan Financial the success it is today. The memo went on to detail specific tactics, partnering with historically black colleges for outreach programs that would never result in actual hiring, creating diversity training sessions that would be mandatory for lower-level employees but optional for executives, and establishing mentorship programs that would pair minority employees with supervisors who had no real power to advance their careers. But the most damning section dealt with what Sterling called strategic documentation. The memo instructed managers to avoid putting discriminatory hiring decisions in writing, to use coded language when discussing candidates from underrepresented groups, and to create paper trails that would protect the company in the event of legal challenges. When rejecting minority candidates, the memo advised, focus on cultural fit and communication skills rather than qualifications. These terms are legally defensible and allow for maximum flexibility in hiring decisions. Marcus photographed each page of the memo with hands that barely trembled despite his anger. This was exactly the kind of evidence he needed, proof that the discrimination he had witnessed was not just the result of individual prejudice, but part of a systematic strategy approved at the highest levels of the company. He carefully placed the memo back in the wastebasket, making sure it appeared exactly as he had found it. Sterling would never know that his confidential strategy had been compromised, that his words would soon be read by federal investigators and civil rights attorneys across the country. The next office belonged to Patricia Hawthorne, the Chief Human Resources Officer. If Sterling was the architect of the company's discriminatory policies, Hawthorne was their chief enforcer. She was responsible for implementing the hiring practices that kept Metropolitan Financial's workforce overwhelmingly white, for conducting the diversity training sessions that served as legal cover rather than actual education, and for handling the complaints of employees who dared to speak up about the treatment they received. Hawthorne's office was decorated with awards from diversity organizations, photographs from charity events supporting minority causes, and certificates recognizing her commitment to equality in the workplace. The irony was so thick that Marcus almost laughed as he began cleaning around her desk. In Hawthorne's inbox, he found a stack of employee complaints that had been marked "resolved" with a rubber stamp. As he glanced through them, a pattern became clear. Every complaint about discriminatory treatment had been dismissed with the same boilerplate language about thorough investigation and no evidence of wrongdoing. The employees who had filed these complaints were either transferred to less desirable positions or had mysteriously left the company shortly after raising their concerns. One complaint in particular caught Marcus's attention. It had been filed by Angela Davis, a talented accountant who had been passed over for promotion 3 times, despite consistently excellent performance reviews. Davis had documented instances of racist comments from her supervisor, unequal treatment compared to her white colleagues, and being excluded from important meetings and client interactions. Hawthorne's response was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. She acknowledged Davis's concerns while simultaneously dismissing them as misunderstandings or misperceptions. She suggested that Davis might benefit from additional training in interpersonal communication, and recommended that she consider a transfer to a better-suited position in a different department. But what made Marcus's blood boil was the handwritten note attached to Davis's file. Troublemaker. Find a way to get rid of her without creating legal exposure. The note was signed with Hawthorne's initials, providing clear evidence that the Chief Human Resources Officer was actively working to silence employees who complained about discrimination. Marcus photographed the entire file, including Hawthorne's handwritten notes and the company's official response. He also noticed that Davis's name was on a list of employees scheduled for performance improvement plans, which Marcus knew from his corporate experience was often a prelude to termination. The discovery prompted him to send a quick, encrypted text message to Davis from a burner phone he kept for emergencies. Document everything. Help is coming. He knew it was a risk to break his cover, but he couldn't stand by and watch another talented employee be destroyed by the system he was working to bring down. The final office on his route belonged to Jonathan Crawford, the CEO of Metropolitan Financial Corporation. Crawford was a man who had built his reputation on transformation, taking over the company 5 years earlier, with promises to modernize its culture and expand its reach into new markets. He was frequently quoted in business magazines talking about the importance of diversity and inclusion in the modern workplace, and his speeches at industry conferences were filled with progressive rhetoric about equality and opportunity. Crawford's office was a monument to success and power. The walls were lined with awards and recognitions, including several from civil rights organizations that had honored him for his leadership in promoting workplace diversity. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface clear except for a few carefully arranged items. A photograph of his family, an expensive pen set, and a leather portfolio embossed with the company logo. As Marcus began cleaning around the desk, he noticed that Crawford's computer was still on, displaying what appeared to be an email exchange from earlier that evening. The conversation was with the company's board of directors, and the subject line made Marcus's pulse quicken. Addressing the janitor situation. Marcus glanced toward the door to make sure he was alone, then leaned closer to read the emails. What he saw made his blood run cold. Someone at Metropolitan Financial had figured out who he really was, and they were planning their response. The first email, from board member Elizabeth Morrison, was direct and alarming. Our background check company has identified a discrepancy in the employment records of Marcus Washington, our night janitor on floors 3839. According to their research, he holds an MBA from Harvard and previously worked as a senior executive at Meridian Investment Group. We need to discuss this immediately. Crawford's response was even more chilling. This explains the unusual behavior patterns our security team has noted. Washington has been spending significantly more time in executive areas than necessary for his cleaning duties, and there have been reports of him photographing documents and equipment. I believe we may be dealing with corporate espionage. The email chain continued with increasingly paranoid speculation about Marcus's motives. Some board members suggested he might be working for a competitor, gathering intelligence about Metropolitan Financial's business strategies. Others wondered if he was planning some kind of lawsuit, though they dismissed this possibility as unlikely given his employment status. But the most disturbing email came from board member Thomas McKenzie, who had apparently done additional research into Marcus's background. I've discovered that Washington was terminated from his previous position following allegations of irregularities in his expense reports. While these charges were never proven, they provide us with leverage if we need to discredit him. I recommend we terminate his employment immediately and conduct a thorough security audit of our systems. Marcus felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. Everything he had worked for over the past 18 months was in jeopardy. Worse, the lie about irregularities in his expense reports was particularly galling, because he knew exactly what had happened at his previous firm. He had been terminated not for any wrongdoing, but because he had refused to participate in a scheme to hide losses from regulatory authorities. His integrity had cost him his career, and now it was being twisted into evidence of corruption. But as he continued reading, Marcus realized that his discovery of these emails might actually be a blessing in disguise. The board's discussion revealed the full extent of their paranoia and their willingness to manufacture evidence to protect themselves. More importantly, it showed that they had no idea about the true scope of his investigation or the evidence he had already gathered. Crawford's final email in the chain outlined their plan. "We'll terminate Washington tomorrow morning, citing budget cuts and restructuring. Our security team will confiscate any company property in his possession and escort him from the building. Legal will prepare a non-disclosure agreement with financial incentives to ensure his silence about anything he may have observed during his employment." The arrogance was breathtaking. They actually believed they could buy his silence with a modest severance package, that an NDA would protect them from the consequences of their discrimination and illegal hiring practices. They had no idea that Marcus had been documenting their crimes for months, that he had already consulted with civil rights attorneys, or that he had backup plans within backup plans. Marcus photographed the entire email chain, making sure to capture every word of their conspiracy to silence him. Then he opened Crawford's desk drawer, looking for additional evidence. What he found exceeded his wildest expectations. A folder marked diversity initiatives that contained the real strategy behind Metropolitan Financial's public relations campaigns. Inside the folder were detailed demographic analyses of the company's workforce, showing the systematic exclusion of minorities from senior positions. There were also communications with public relations firms about crafting messages that would deflect criticism without requiring actual change, and contracts with diversity consultants who were paid to provide favorable reports that could be used to defend against discrimination claims. But the most damning document was a memo from Crawford to the board of directors, dated just 3 months earlier, that laid out the company's true position on diversity. While we must appear responsive to social pressure regarding diversity and inclusion, we must not allow these concerns to compromise the standards that have made our company successful. Our clients expect a certain level of professionalism and competence that may not align with aggressive diversity hiring. The memo went on to outline strategies for maintaining their discriminatory practices while creating the appearance of progress. They would hire minorities for visible but relatively powerless positions, promote a select few to mid-level management roles as tokens to point to when challenged, and ensure that real decision-making power remained concentrated in the hands of executives who shared their values and background. As Marcus photographed each page, he realized that he had stumbled upon the smoking gun that would bring down not just individual employees, but the entire leadership structure of Metropolitan Financial Corporation. This was evidence of a conspiracy that reached to the very top of the company, proof that the discrimination he had witnessed was not just tolerated but actively encouraged by those in power. But he also realized that time was running out. If Crawford and the board planned to terminate him the next morning, he had less than 8 hours to execute the plan he had been developing for months. All the evidence in the world would be worthless if he was escorted from the building before he could act on it. As he finished his cleaning routine and prepared to leave the executive floor, Marcus felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. His cover had been blown, but he had gained access to evidence that would make his case airtight. The next few hours would determine whether his 18 months of careful planning would result in justice or disaster. The elevator carried him back to the ground floor, where Thompson, the security guard, was still absorbed in his magazine. As Marcus signed out and headed for the exit, he knew he was walking out of Metropolitan Financial Corporation for the last time as an employee. But if everything went according to plan, he would be back very soon, in a very different capacity. The revolution he had been planning was about to begin, and the executives who thought they could silence him with threats and NDAs were about to learn that they had underestimated the wrong man. Marcus Washington was not just a janitor with a grudge. He was a Harvard-trained business strategist with 18 months of evidence and a plan that would reshape the corporate landscape forever. The pre-dawn hours of Chicago were Marcus Washington's most productive time. While the city slept and the executives of Metropolitan Financial Corporation dreamed in their suburban mansions, Marcus sat in his modest studio apartment, surrounded by months of carefully gathered evidence, executing the most important business strategy of his life. 3 laptops hummed quietly on his kitchen table, each connected to different secure networks he had established over the past year. On the first screen, he was uploading files to secure cloud servers located in 3 different countries, ensuring that his evidence would survive any attempt to destroy it. On the second, he was finalizing legal documents that would be filed in federal court within hours. On the third, he was preparing the media presentation that would expose Metropolitan Financial's corruption to the world. The apartment was spartanly furnished, a far cry from the luxury condo he had once owned. But every penny he had saved from his janitor's salary had been invested in this moment: legal fees, investigation costs, technology, and the kind of security measures that would protect him from the inevitable corporate retaliation he was about to face. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Maya Patel, the civil rights attorney who had been secretly working with him for the past 6 months. "Everything is in position," the message read. "Federal agents are standing by. Media contacts confirmed. Are you ready to pull the trigger?" Marcus typed back, "Confirmed. Operation begins at 7 a.m. sharp." Maya had been skeptical when Marcus first contacted her, suspecting that a janitor claiming to have explosive evidence against a major corporation was probably delusional. But when he had shown up at her office with meticulously organized documentation, professional presentations, and a strategic plan that demonstrated his business acumen, she had quickly realized she was dealing with something extraordinary. Over the following months, Maya had assembled a team of the best civil rights attorneys in the country, each bringing expertise in different aspects of employment law, corporate governance, and federal civil rights enforcement. They had worked pro bono, motivated not just by the potential for a landmark case, but by the sheer audacity of what Marcus was attempting to accomplish. The legal strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than filing a traditional discrimination lawsuit that would drag through the courts for years while Metropolitan Financial's lawyers deployed delay tactics and procedural challenges, Marcus had opted for a multi-front assault that would overwhelm the company's ability to respond effectively. The first wave would be a federal civil rights complaint filed simultaneously with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Department of Justice, supported by hundreds of pages of documented evidence and dozens of recorded conversations. The complaint would trigger immediate federal investigations into the company's hiring practices, creating legal jeopardy that would capture the attention of Metropolitan Financial's board of directors and insurance companies. The second wave would be a shareholder derivative lawsuit filed on behalf of the company's investors, alleging that the board of directors had breached their fiduciary duty by exposing the company to massive legal liability through their discriminatory practices. This would create internal pressure for change by threatening the personal wealth of the executives who had created the toxic culture. The third wave would be a coordinated media campaign, timed to coincide with the legal filings, that would expose the company's practices to public scrutiny and consumer boycotts. Maya had cultivated relationships with investigative journalists at major newspapers, television networks, and online publications, all of whom were eager to break the story of corporate discrimination in the post-2020 era of heightened awareness about racial justice. But the most devastating element of Marcus's strategy was something that Maya's legal team had initially dismissed as impossible: a takeover of Metropolitan Financial Corporation itself. Marcus had spent months studying the company's ownership structure, financial condition, and corporate governance. What he had discovered was that Metropolitan Financial was more vulnerable than its executives realized. The company's stock price had been declining for 2 years due to poor investment decisions and regulatory troubles. Several major institutional investors had been quietly expressing concerns about management's performance, and most importantly, a significant portion of the company's shares were held by pension funds and socially responsible investment firms that would be horrified to learn about the systematic discrimination their investments were supporting. Working with a small group of progressive investment managers who specialized in corporate activism, Marcus had quietly assembled a coalition of investors who controlled nearly 30% of Metropolitan Financial's outstanding shares. These investors had agreed to support a complete overhaul of the company's management structure once the evidence of discrimination became public. The plan was audacious: expose the corruption, trigger federal investigations that would devastate the company's stock price, and then execute a hostile takeover that would install new leadership committed to genuine equality and reform. It was corporate warfare fought with the weapons of justice, and Marcus was about to fire the opening shot. At exactly 6:30 a.m., Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized: Patricia Hawthorne from Human Resources. This was the call he had been expecting, the one that would officially terminate his employment and attempt to silence him with legal threats and financial inducements. "Mr. Washington," Hawthorne's voice was professionally cold, "I need you to come into the office this morning to discuss some administrative matters regarding your employment." "I see," Marcus replied, keeping his own voice neutral.
What time would be convenient? Please be here at 8 a.m. sharp.
Come directly to my office and ask security to escort you. Don't stop at any other floors or departments. The instructions confirmed what Marcus had learned from Crawford's emails. They were planning to terminate him, confiscate any evidence they thought he might have, and force him to sign a non-disclosure agreement, under threat of legal action. It was exactly the kind of heavy-handed corporate intimidation that had kept their discrimination hidden for years.
"I'll be there," Marcus said and hung up.
At 7 a.m. precisely, Maya Patel walked into the Chicago office of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and filed a complaint that would change everything. The 847-page document, supported by audio recordings, photographs, internal memos, and expert analysis, painted a devastating picture of systematic discrimination at Metropolitan Financial Corporation. Simultaneously, similar complaints were filed with the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Illinois Department of Human Rights. Federal agents were dispatched to preserve evidence at Metropolitan Financial's offices, armed with court orders that would prevent the company from destroying documents or intimidating witnesses. At the same moment, investigative reporters at the Chicago Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, and CNN received comprehensive briefing packages that detailed the scope of Metropolitan Financial's discriminatory practices. The reporters had been working on their stories for weeks, with Maya's team providing background information and access to documented evidence while protecting Marcus's identity. By 7:15 a.m., the first news alerts were already appearing on financial websites. Federal investigation launched into Metropolitan Financial Corporation for alleged civil rights violations. The company's stock price immediately began falling in pre-market trading as investors tried to assess the magnitude of the crisis. Marcus watched the early news coverage on his laptop while getting dressed for what would be his final confrontation with Patricia Hawthorne and the executives who had dismissed him as invisible for 18 months. He put on his janitor's uniform one last time, but underneath it he wore a tailored business suit that he had kept from his previous career. Before leaving the apartment, he placed a Harvard Business School class ring on his finger, a symbol of the education and achievements that his tormentors had never bothered to discover. The morning commute to Metropolitan Financial felt different than it had for the past 18 months. Marcus was no longer sneaking through the shadows, gathering evidence for a future confrontation. He was walking into battle as himself, fully armed with the truth and the legal firepower to back it up. The lobby of Metropolitan Financial Corporation was buzzing with unusual activity when Marcus arrived at 7:45 a.m. Security guards were talking urgently into their radios. Executives were arriving earlier than usual with grim expressions, and the normally composed receptionists looked rattled. Word of the federal investigation had clearly reached the building, even though the full scope of the crisis was still unknown to most employees. Thompson, the security guard who had barely acknowledged Marcus for 18 months, looked nervous as he approached the reception desk. "You're supposed to go straight up to HR," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Mrs. Hawthorne is waiting for you." As the elevator carried him to the 38th floor, Marcus felt a strange sense of completion. This was the same route he had taken countless times as an invisible janitor, but now he was rising through the building as something very different, a force of justice that would reshape everything these executives had built. Patricia Hawthorne was waiting in her office, flanked by two men Marcus didn't recognize. Their expensive suits and briefcases marked them as corporate attorneys, brought in to handle what the company still believed was a simple employment termination. They had no idea that their client was already under federal investigation, that their every move was being monitored by agents with court orders, or that the quiet janitor they were about to intimidate had checkmate them before the game had even begun. "Mr. Washington," Hawthorne began, gesturing to a chair in front of her desk. "Please have a seat. We need to discuss some changes to your employment status." Marcus remained standing, his posture straight and confident in a way that seemed to surprise everyone in the room. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying an authority that these people had never heard from him before, "I think you should know that you're all under federal investigation for civil rights violations." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. One of the attorneys reached for his phone, probably to call the company's law firm. Hawthorne's face went pale as she realized that their plan to quietly terminate and silence the janitor had been completely turned on its head. The second attorney began asking rapid-fire questions about what Marcus knew and how he had obtained his information. Marcus raised his hand for silence, and surprisingly, they all stopped talking. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. The janitor they had dismissed as invisible was now the only person who could explain what was happening to their world. "My name is Marcus Washington," he said, pulling out his Harvard class ring and placing it on the desk in front of Hawthorne. I hold an MBA from Harvard Business School and I spent 8 years as a senior executive in corporate finance before taking a position here as your night janitor. For the past 18 months, I have been documenting the systematic discrimination and racist practices that permeate this company at every level. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder, placing it next to the ring. This contains copies of recorded conversations, internal memos, hiring documents, and email exchanges that demonstrate a clear pattern of civil rights violations. As of this morning, this evidence has been filed with federal authorities and is being reviewed by teams of investigators and prosecutors.
The silence in the room was deafening.
Hawthorne stared at the folder as if it were a bomb that might explode at any moment. The attorneys looked like they were calculating how much trouble their firm was about to face for representing a company that had just become a federal target. You see, Marcus continued, you all made a critical error in judgment. You assumed that because I cleaned your offices and emptied your trash, I couldn't understand the significance of what you were saying and doing. You treated me as if I were invisible, which allowed me to see everything you tried to hide. His voice grew stronger, carrying 18 months of suppressed anger and determination. You laughed at my intelligence, questioned my work ethic, and dismissed my humanity. But while you were busy congratulating yourselves on your superior breeding and education, I was building a case that will end your careers and transform this company forever. Hawthorne finally found her voice. This is corporate espionage, she stammered. You were hired to clean offices, not to spy on confidential business operations. Marcus smiled, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. Actually, I was hired to clean up the messes in this building. And that's exactly what I've done. The silence that followed Marcus's revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity. Patricia Hawthorne sat frozen behind her desk, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, fear, and desperate calculation. The two corporate attorneys flanking her chair looked like men who had just realized they were standing in a minefield, each afraid that their next move might trigger an explosion that would destroy their careers. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hawthorne's office, Chicago was waking up to a news story that would dominate headlines for months to come. Television crews were already setting up across the street from Metropolitan Financial Corporation, their satellite trucks creating a media circus that would only grow as the day progressed. The company's stock price had fallen 23% in pre-market trading, wiping out hundreds of millions of dollars in shareholder value before most people had finished their morning coffee. This is impossible, Hawthorne finally whispered, staring at the Harvard-class ring that Marcus had placed on her desk like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. You're a janitor. You clean toilets and empty trash cans. You can't possibly have the sophistication to orchestrate something like this. Marcus leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment to savor the complete reversal of power that was playing out before him. For 18 months he had endured their casual racism, their dismissive attitudes, and their fundamental assumption that his dark skin and working-class uniform meant he was intellectually inferior. Now, in the space of a few minutes, he had shattered their worldview completely. That's exactly the kind of thinking that got you into this situation, he said calmly. You see what you expect to see, and you expect to see failure and incompetence when you look at someone like me. It never occurred to you that I might be gathering intelligence, building a case, or planning something that would threaten everything you've built here. One of the attorneys, a nervous man with thinning hair and expensive glasses, finally spoke up. What exactly do you want, Mr. Rabble? Washington, what would it take to resolve this situation quietly and amicably? The question revealed everything about how these people thought, how they had always operated. They believed that every problem could be solved with money, that every challenge could be managed through legal maneuvering and corporate power. They had no understanding that Marcus was not seeking a payout or a settlement, but complete and total transformation of the system that had created their toxic culture. You still don't understand, Marcus said, shaking his head with something approaching pity. This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a business dispute that can be resolved through confidential settlements and non-disclosure agreements. This is justice, and justice cannot be bought or bargained away. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the media crews assembling in the street below. In about 30 minutes, the first television reports will begin airing. They will detail the systematic discrimination that has been documented at this company for the past 18 months. They will include audio recordings of senior executives making racist comments, photographs of discriminatory hiring documents, and expert analysis of your employment patterns that show clear bias against minority candidates. Turning back to face the room, Marcus continued with the precision of a prosecutor laying out a case. By noon, federal agents will be serving subpoenas for all personnel records, email servers, and financial documents related to hiring and promotion decisions. Your computers will be impounded, Your executives will be questioned under oath, and your business operations will be scrutinized by teams of investigators who specialize in civil rights violations. The second attorney, an older man with silver hair and a reputation for handling corporate crises, tried to interrupt. Now see here, Mr. Washington, you may think you have some evidence of wrongdoing, but corporate law is complex and proving discrimination in court is extremely difficult. I'm sure we can reach an understanding that would be beneficial for everyone involved. Marcus pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Suddenly, the room filled with the sound of Richard Sterling's voice, recorded during a meeting 3 months earlier.
We need to be more careful about our hiring practices.
Too many of these diversity candidates are slipping through, and our clients are starting to notice. The last thing we need is for Metropolitan Financial to get a reputation as one of those companies that values political correctness over competence. The recording continued with Sterling outlining specific strategies for screening out minority candidates while maintaining legal cover. The voices of other executives joined in, each contributing their own suggestions for maintaining discriminatory practices while avoiding detection. By the time the recording ended, the two attorneys looked like they were witnessing their own professional execution. I have over 40 hours of similar recordings, Marcus said, putting his phone away. I have hundreds of documents, thousands of photographs, and detailed analysis of hiring patterns that would make a statistician weep. But more importantly, I have something you never expected: credibility. He walked back to Hawthorne's desk and leaned forward, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. You see, when a Harvard MBA with 8 years of executive experience presents evidence to federal investigators, they take it seriously. When that same person has spent 18 months gathering evidence while working as a janitor, demonstrating the dedication and persistence to seek justice despite personal cost, they believe every word he says. Hawthorne finally found some of her composure, though her voice still trembled with barely controlled panic. What you've done is illegal. You violated your employment agreement, invaded privacy, and engaged in corporate espionage. We'll have you arrested and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Marcus smiled again, the expression carrying a weight of knowledge and preparation that seemed to fill the entire room.
Actually, everything I've done is completely legal.
I consulted with civil rights attorneys from the beginning, ensuring that every piece of evidence was gathered in compliance with federal and state laws. Recording conversations in public spaces, photographing documents left in open view, and documenting discriminatory behavior are all protected activities under whistleblower statutes. He opened the folder he had placed on the desk and pulled out a thick legal document. This is a federal court order protecting me from retaliation, issued this morning in connection with a civil rights complaint that was filed at 7 a.m. Any attempt to terminate me, intimidate me, or prosecute me for gathering this evidence would constitute obstruction of justice and violation of federal civil rights laws. The impact of these words on the people in the room was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Hawthorne slumped back in her chair, finally understanding that her carefully constructed career was about to become collateral damage in a legal war that had already been decided. The attorneys were frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how to distance their firm from a client that was about to become radioactive. But Marcus was just getting started. The real devastation was still to come. The civil rights investigation is actually just the beginning, he said, pulling additional documents from the folder. You see, while I was gathering evidence of discrimination, I also discovered some interesting irregularities in the company's financial reporting, particularly regarding the diversity consulting contracts and the allocation of resources for minority recruitment programs. This was the moment Marcus had been building toward for months, the revelation that would transform a civil rights case into a corporate governance crisis that would threaten the very existence of Metropolitan Financial Corporation.
It appears that several senior executives, including Mr. Kutta,
Sterling and Mr. Crawford, have been billing the company for diversity consulting services that were never actually provided. They created shell companies, paid themselves consulting fees for fake diversity training programs, and reported these expenses as legitimate business costs to shareholders and regulatory authorities. He placed copies of financial records on the desk, each page highlighting transactions that showed a clear pattern of fraud and embezzlement. Over the past 3 years, more than $12 million has been diverted from actual diversity programs into the personal accounts of executives who were simultaneously working to maintain discriminatory hiring practices. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Financial fraud was a federal crime that carried serious prison sentences, and the evidence Marcus was presenting showed a systematic pattern of theft that would be impossible to explain away or dismiss. The Securities and Exchange Commission will be very interested in these documents, Marcus continued. particularly since Metropolitan Financial has been claiming tax deductions for diversity programs that never existed, while reporting false information to shareholders about the company's commitment to equality. One of the attorneys stood up abruptly, clearly recognizing that his firm's continued association with Metropolitan Financial could result in their own legal liability. I think we need to terminate this meeting immediately and consult with our clients about these allegations. But Marcus wasn't finished. The final blow was still to come, the revelation that would complete the destruction of everything these people had built their careers upon. "There's one more thing you should know," he said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who held all the cards in a game his opponents had never realized they were playing. As of this morning, a coalition of institutional investors controlling 38% of Metropolitan Financial's outstanding shares has called for an emergency shareholders meeting to remove the entire board of directors and executive leadership team. The room went completely silent. Even in their panic, the people facing Marcus understood the magnitude of what he had just revealed. A hostile takeover backed by major institutional investors was every corporate executive's worst nightmare, especially when it was triggered by evidence of systematic fraud and discrimination. The pension funds that invested in this company to secure retirements for teachers, firefighters, and public employees are horrified to learn that their money has been supporting racist hiring practices. The socially responsible investment firms that included Metropolitan Financial in their portfolios based on its stated commitment to diversity are demanding immediate change in leadership. Marcus gathered up his documents and returned them to the folder, his movements deliberate and confident. The shareholders' meeting has been scheduled for next Friday. By then, the full scope of the federal investigation will be public knowledge, the financial fraud will be front-page news, and the stock price will have collapsed to a level that makes a takeover both inevitable and affordable. He stood up and adjusted his janitor's uniform, a gesture that seemed to emphasize the contrast between his appearance and the sophisticated corporate warfare he had just unleashed. The new board of directors and executive team will be announced at that meeting. I'm told that they will be committed to genuine diversity, transparent business practices, and compensation policies that reward actual performance rather than discriminatory behavior. As he walked toward the door, Marcus paused and looked back at the people who had tormented him for 18 months, who had treated him as invisible and unworthy of basic human respect. They sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that the janitor they had dismissed had orchestrated the complete destruction of their professional lives. "Oh, and one more thing," he said, his hand on the door handle. "I've been offered a position with the new management team. It seems they're looking for someone with my particular combination of business experience, legal knowledge, and intimate familiarity with the problems that need to be fixed here." He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving behind the world of shadows and silence that he had inhabited for 18 months. Outside the office, federal agents were already beginning their investigation, interviewing employees and collecting evidence that would support the cases that were about to reshape the entire corporate landscape. Marcus Washington was no longer a janitor. He was the architect of justice, the man who had brought down an empire of prejudice through patience, intelligence, and the kind of strategic thinking that his tormentors had never imagined possible. The revolution he had promised was now underway, and there would be no going back to the way things were. 6 months after the morning that changed everything, Marcus Washington stood in the same corner office that had once belonged to Jonathan Crawford. But the view from the 42nd floor looked very different now. Where once the Metropolitan Financial Corporation building had been a monument to exclusion and discrimination, it had been transformed into something that the old guard could never have imagined. A workplace where merit was actually measured by performance rather than skin color, where diversity was not just a public relations slogan, but a fundamental business strategy. The transformation had been swift and brutal. Within 72 hours of Marcus's confrontation with Patricia Hawthorne, the federal investigation had expanded to include not just civil rights violations but securities fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering charges. The FBI had executed search warrants at the homes and offices of 17 senior executives, seizing computers, financial records, and communications that painted an even more damning picture of systematic corruption than Marcus had originally uncovered. The media coverage had been relentless and devastating. Every major news organization had covered the story of the janitor who brought down a financial empire. But more importantly, they had focused on the documented evidence of discrimination that had affected hundreds of employees over many years. The recordings of racist conversations, the photographs of discriminatory hiring documents, and the financial evidence of fraudulent diversity programs had created a narrative that resonated far beyond the business world. Congressional hearings had been scheduled, regulatory agencies had announced comprehensive reviews of hiring practices across the financial industry, Civil rights organizations had used the Metropolitan Financial case as a catalyst for broader campaigns against corporate discrimination. The ripple effects were still spreading, touching companies and industries that had previously believed themselves immune to serious scrutiny. But perhaps most importantly, the hostile takeover had succeeded beyond everyone's wildest expectations. The coalition of institutional investors that Marcus had helped assemble had not only removed the old board of directors and executive team, but it installed new leadership committed to implementing the most aggressive diversity and inclusion program in the financial industry. Marcus had been offered his choice of positions in the new organization. He could have returned to his previous role as a senior executive, could have taken a position in the legal department leveraging his knowledge of civil rights law, or could have accepted a consulting role helping other companies address their own discrimination problems. Instead, he had chosen something that surprised everyone. Chief Diversity Officer, a newly created position that reported directly to the CEO and had authority over hiring, promotion, and corporate culture initiatives across the entire organization. It was a role that would allow him to build the kind of workplace he had envisioned during those long nights of cleaning offices and gathering evidence. The irony was not lost on him. The same executives who had mocked the idea of diversity hires and questioned the qualifications of minority candidates now worked for a company where the top diversity officer was a Harvard MBA who had proven his worth through 18 months of the most sophisticated corporate espionage in business history. The view from his new office included the federal courthouse where many of his former tormentors were now facing trial. Richard Sterling, the former chief financial officer, had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for embezzlement and securities fraud. Patricia Hawthorne had received 6 years for civil rights violations and obstruction of justice. Jonathan Crawford, the former CEO, was still fighting charges that could result in a 20-year sentence if he was convicted on all counts. But the criminal prosecutions were just one measure of the transformation that had occurred. The new Metropolitan Financial Corporation bore little resemblance to the company that had employed Marcus as a janitor. The workforce had been diversified through aggressive recruitment at historically black colleges and universities, Hispanic-serving institutions, and programs specifically designed to identify talented candidates who had been overlooked by traditional hiring practices. The results had been remarkable. Employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in workplace culture. Productivity had increased as teams became more diverse and innovative. Most importantly, the company's financial performance had improved significantly as new perspectives and approaches had been brought to investment strategies and client relationships. Marcus had implemented programs that went far beyond traditional diversity initiatives. Every hiring manager was required to undergo comprehensive bias training that included real-world simulations and ongoing assessment. Promotion decisions were reviewed by diverse panels to ensure that advancement opportunities were not limited by the old boy networks that had previously dominated the company culture. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus had established an employee protection program that ensured anyone who reported discrimination or harassment would be supported throughout the investigation process, with legal representation provided, and protection against retaliation guaranteed. It was the kind of support that would have made a difference to employees like Angela Davis, who had suffered in silence for years before Marcus's investigation exposed the systematic problems that had made her life miserable. Davis, in fact, had become one of Marcus's key allies in the transformation process. She had been promoted to Senior Vice President for Client Relations, a role that leveraged her accounting expertise while giving her the authority to rebuild relationships with clients who had been alienated by the previous management's discriminatory attitudes. Her success in that role had become a powerful symbol of what was possible when talent was recognized and supported regardless of background. The changes extended beyond hiring and promotion to every aspect of the company's operations. Vendor relationships had been restructured to include minority-owned businesses that had previously been excluded from consideration. Community outreach programs had been established to provide financial literacy education and small business support in underserved neighborhoods. The company's investment strategies now included environmental, social, and governance criteria that aligned profits with positive social impact. The transformation had not been without challenges. Some employees who had thrived under the old system had struggled to adapt to the new culture of accountability and merit-based advancement. A few had left voluntarily, while others had been terminated for refusing to embrace the changes, or for continuing discriminatory behavior despite extensive training and support. But the overwhelming majority of employees had embraced the new direction with enthusiasm that surprised even Marcus. It turned out that many people had been uncomfortable with the previous culture, but had felt powerless to challenge it. When given the opportunity to work in an environment that valued their contributions and treated them with dignity, They had responded with increased loyalty and productivity that had transformed the company's reputation in the industry. Marcus's success at Metropolitan Financial had also opened doors to broader influence. He had been invited to speak at business schools, corporate conferences, and civil rights organizations about the strategies and principles that had driven the transformation. A book deal was in the works with the working title Invisible No More: How Corporate Espionage Exposed Systematic Racism and Transformed a Company. But, more importantly, other companies had begun reaching out for consultation on their own diversity and inclusion challenges. Marcus had established a consulting firm that specialized in identifying and addressing institutional bias, with a client list that included Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and non-profit organizations. The approach that had worked at Metropolitan Financial was being replicated across industries and sectors. The combination of rigorous documentation, legal accountability, and strategic pressure was proving effective at creating genuine change rather than cosmetic public relations improvements. The model was being studied by business schools and policy experts as a template for addressing discrimination in corporate America. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Marcus's new role was the opportunity to mentor young professionals who were beginning their careers in an environment very different from what he had experienced. The company now offered internship programs, mentorship opportunities, and leadership development initiatives specifically designed to support talented individuals who might have been overlooked by traditional recruitment methods. One of those mentees was James Mitchell, a young African-American analyst who had graduated from a state university with outstanding grades but limited networking connections. Under the old Metropolitan Financial, Mitchell would never have been hired. Under Marcus's leadership, he had been identified as a high-potential candidate, provided with comprehensive training and support, and rapidly promoted based on his performance and contributions. Watching Mitchell succeed was deeply rewarding for Marcus, but it also served as a reminder of how many talented individuals had been lost to the discriminatory practices that had previously dominated not just Metropolitan Financial, but the entire industry. The waste of human potential represented by systematic discrimination was staggering, and Marcus was determined to ensure that the transformation he had initiated would continue long after his tenure ended. The legal cases stemming from Marcus's investigation were still working their way through the courts, but the outcomes were already clear. The federal government had recovered over $50 million in fraudulent claims and tax deductions, money that was being used to fund genuine diversity programs across multiple agencies. Civil rights organizations had won landmark settlements that would provide compensation to hundreds of employees who had suffered discrimination over the years. But beyond the financial and legal victories, the Metropolitan Financial case had become a symbol of what was possible when individuals refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Marcus had proven that systematic discrimination could be challenged and defeated, that corporate cultures could be transformed, and that merit-based systems actually worked better than the exclusionary practices that had previously been accepted as normal. The view from Marcus's office window now included a diverse stream of employees entering and leaving the building, people of all backgrounds who knew that their contributions would be valued and their advancement would be based on performance rather than prejudice. It was a sight that filled him with pride every day, but it also served as a constant reminder that the work was far from finished. Discrimination still existed in corporate America, and systematic change would require sustained effort across multiple industries and institutions. But the precedent had been set, the legal framework had been established, and the business case for diversity had been proven through measurable results. Marcus Washington had begun his journey as an invisible janitor, dismissed and disrespected by people who judged him by his uniform rather than his capabilities. He had ended it as a transformational leader who had reshaped not just a single company, but the broader conversation about equality and justice in corporate America. The boy who had grown up in poverty, worked his way through Harvard Business School, and survived the economic devastation that had cost him his first career, had finally found his true calling. He was no longer fighting for his own success, but for a future where talent and character would matter more than background and connections. Standing in his corner office, looking out at the city where he had once cleaned buildings in the darkness while powerful people slept, Marcus understood that he had accomplished something that would outlast his own career and continue transforming lives for generations to come. The janitor who had been invisible had become the architect of a more visible, more just, and more successful future for everyone.